Okay, well, welcome everyone to History Matters and So Does Coffee. Today's topic, as ever, I came up with yesterday. I agonize over what I want to talk about, and I try and connect it to the week, and then I'm not sure. At any rate, what I want to talk about today is when lines are crossed and what sparked this. And I'm actually not going to talk about it very much, but just the idea of Kanye West spilling over with anti-Semitism, which then led me to ask, so when are lines crossed? Because I'm thinking there are some big lines being crossed here, and how do we examine that? But before I talk about that, I'm going to turn to my partner in crime, and she will explain the rules of the game.
So good morning, everybody. It's really great to be back after the last couple of weeks. We were working remotely, I guess, each of us. We had a couple of pre-recorded sessions. I was off traveling. I am away from home. As you can see, my pumpkin wall is not behind me that you guys are used to. Our friend Carol Lee, who's always on here with us Fridays, she is actually at my booth at NCSS watching this from the booth so that I can be here with you. But I'm Annie Evans. I'm with the New American History Project, and I am delighted to be with you. The way this works, if you're a first time joining us, is Joanne's going to talk for about 30 minutes. While she's talking, you can put your questions in the Q&A. You can also engage in a very robust chat with our community here. But if you have specific questions on this topic, and I think a lot of people are going to have some great questions on this particular topic, please put those in the Q&A. And in about 30 minutes, we will address your questions.
Excellent. And I do want to say, and thank you, Andy, for reminding me of this. I've been saying, like, okay, it's live again. We're back,
Yay.
And I had forgotten to sort of celebrate that fact that we pre-recorded so that we would not miss a week, because we have such a track record. And Carol is not here to tell us 132, 133, 134, 130 something straight episodes. But at any rate, I am glad we are back. I am glad to see you and be here with you. And let us begin plunging into the topic. And as I just suggested a moment ago, it was Kanye West, and I guess I'm not going to go into much detail, but he was on some kind of, I don't know if it was a radio show or a podcast or whatever the heck it was, really going even beyond where he's gone before with his anti-Semitic ranting. And based on what I saw other people saying he was saying, I asked myself, as many people are asking about many things these days, when exactly is a line crossed? Like when precisely does anyone say a line has been crossed? Now, in one way or another, we've been saying this, asking this for several years. Right? When will someone pipe up and say a line has been crossed? And the question, I'm not going to become extremely political now. I ask myself that more about one side of the aisle than the other. Why is nobody speaking up and saying a line has been crossed? And that's a big question, and it's a question that's years long and is continuing on even now along similar lines. And I think I did an episode on hearings and what you can expect from hearings and why hearings are important. And I wrote an op-ed somewhere, and I don't remember where. Maybe the New York Times. You guys are like the amazing Googler, so you will find it. I wrote an op-ed that said, I thought that regardless of the outcome of such a hearing, that having a hearing regarding January 6th was vitally important, because the hearing itself would be a statement that a line has been crossed. And the lack of a hearing would be suggesting that to some degree what happened was normal. So regardless of the outcome, to me, it was beyond vitally important to say, with the creation of a hearing, a line has been crossed. And here we're formally, officially declaring that And now we will begin the process and see where it goes. So, sometimes I think it is important, this is going to be a vast understatement in our current times, to state, not only to state that there is a line, but that it has been crossed, to point it out, to call it out into the public, to basically say, yeah, okay, you're doing what you're doing, but you're crossing a lot of lines and we're noticing. So if you're going to do that, own it. I've talked a lot about accountability before too. That is the understatement of the year. I'm talking about accountability all the time. But some of what we're seeing right now does relate to that as well, which is people saying and doing all kinds of things and then assuming they have no accountability for any of it. Free speech. Yeah, that's not what free speech means. And I've been tweeting and tooting and whatever they're posting about that for the last week or two as well. Yeah, you can say whatever you want, and then you're accountable for what you've said. Seems pretty straightforward, but some people seem to have a hard time saying that. At any rate, this is what I wanted to address today, is moments when a line has been crossed and what happens during that moment. And probably not surprisingly to some of you who may have tuned in to the talk that I gave yesterday to the Capitol Historical Society. I'm not going to repeat myself, but what I am going to talk about today relates to the election of 1800. That's what I talked about yesterday, the election of 1800 and the 12th Amendment that resulted from the big mess that election created. And it's online, and I know you amazing Googlers will find it. It's been posted on the Capitol Historical Society website, and I think it's on YouTube. So if you're curious, it's floating around out there. But that was an election where, in many ways, many lines were crossed. But interestingly, and I'll talk a little bit about this today, each side accused the other one of crossing the line, which I'm going to detail a little bit here. The very quick version of that election, because the line crossing, in a sense, doesn't happen until the actual counting of votes during a tie vote takes place. Because of the way presidents were elected in this period, electors voted for two people during presidential electors, and in the end, they were all counted up, and whatever person got the most votes would be president, and whatever person got the second most votes would be vice president. Clearly, when the Constitution was created, they were not at all, and why would they? I've talked about this before too, thinking about political parties, party tickets. They could not have conceived of the idea that the entire nation would have somehow cohered around one idea or one person. I mean, the most that the nation cohered around anything in their recent past was fighting off the British, although at least surrounding the Constitution, there was somewhat of a coming together. But at any rate, in 1796, that quirky way, by today's standards, of electing a president resulted in John Adams, a Federalist president, Thomas Jefferson, let's call him a Jeffersonian Republican, a Democratic Republican vice president, which was a tricky thing during the late 1790s, which was a really, really fraught period that included, among other things, an almost war, the quasi-war with France, the Alien and Sedition Acts that were trying to clamp down on criticism of the government during a time of war, and French immigrants, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which were talking about the idea that states could nullify in one way or another national legislation that seemed to be unconstitutional. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and certainly people understood as the elections coming around, given all of that, and the fact that by 1800, it's pretty clear that the Democratic Republicans are more comfortable with what we now brand democracy, popular participation, popular protest, and that the Federalists were less comfortable with that, and that basically, depending on what direction you went, would be potentially a major turning point for the country. So much as other elections that we have experienced in the recent past, Americans in 1800 understood that the coming election was going to have big consequences. And, for people with power, the Federalists, were basically looking at their potential loss of power on a national stage and potentially never gaining it back. And they never really did. They kept it locally. And the Democratic Republicans are thinking that maybe this is their moment to stop being the opposition party and to step forward and get power and change the nature of national character and governance. So it's a big deal, and not just for the elite, but the public understands that as well. I yesterday quoted one of my favorite Federalist campaigning slogans during this election, which was, wasn't even a specific person. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was like, vote for, I'm going to get it wrong. Look at this. I don't have it in front of me. I don't know. It's essentially John, vote for Adams or vote for Jefferson and no God. He's an atheist. At any rate, really fraught election. And I talk more about the almost comical, extreme language, rhetoric, actions being taken surrounding the election. The line gets crossed, or the lines begin to get crossed, when the core problem of the election of 1800 happens. And that is the two people who get the most votes, who are the candidates, are Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And they're on the same side. And generally speaking, it was generally understood that Jefferson was intended to be the presidential candidate and that Burr was intended to be the vice presidential candidate. But now you've got a tie. The tie needs to be broken. The way to break a tie is to throw the election into the House. Each state votes one by one. Each state has one vote, and that is supposed to determine the election. So the tie is declared. Everyone realizes, wow, the two candidates on one side. So first the Federalists are like, uh-oh, this isn't good. You can imagine Hamilton. He's like, wow, Jefferson or Burr as president. And I won't talk about it here, but he ends up preferring Jefferson. But what do? So the election is thrown into the House, and they voted, before they broke the tie, they voted 35 times over 6 days. They could not break the tie, again and again and again. And this is the part where you begin to get talk about cross lines, precisely because people understood, and particularly these national politicians, understood that this was an important moment when potentially desperate measures should be taken, or else the union, the nation will fall. That's the logic being used here. People were willing to go to extremes in a really extreme way. But as I suggested at the outset, this morning I did a little research, additional research, and came across some interesting things that I definitely did not talk about yesterday that highlight this idea about who actually crossed the line. So I did mention yesterday, and I'll mention it again here, Jefferson, after the election, talks about what happened during the election, and he makes it very clear that the Federalists were thinking about crossing a line. He says, in one way or another, they were going to find some other way to elect a president. They were going to, not his words, but modern words, steal the election, right? They were going to declare somehow or other, maybe make a president pro tem. They didn't necessarily have a single solution, but they were going to find a way to not elect Jefferson president. They didn't at this point. They might have been okay with Burr, but that didn't seem likely by the time we get to a certain point in the vote counting. They just don't want Jefferson president. So they're beginning to talk to essentially not, and I'm going to come back to this idea, not to abandon the Constitution. As Jefferson puts it in one of his letters, they say they are stretching the Constitution, and their word. And that's important. I'm going to come back to that. But they're saying, okay, we're actually not crossing the ultimate line. We're just stretching the Constitution. And that will be a way for us to get out of this bind somehow. And Thomas Jefferson won't be president. Now, Jefferson, I have talked about this before. Jefferson says that at the time, faced with that kind of talk, he and his friends let it be known that if there was an attempt to steal the election, it would be met with, quote, armed resistance, and that ultimately there might be a new constitutional convention of sorts. And even though I've known that for years, in the current context, it just startles me every time. Armed resistance. And he says that in Maryland and Virginia, the governors are beginning to corral militia and weapons, and they're preparing to, if they need to, march on the Capitol and take the election for who it was intended to be given to. There's one of the letters I stumbled across this morning is Jefferson saying to someone in a tone that felt to me almost boastful. It's like, yeah, Virginia was really bristling. This is after the election. Virginia was really bristling. Like they were really about to take extreme action. I'll find out when I talk to Monroe when I go back home. But at any rate, that's how far things went. And some Republicans, John Beckley, who's an influential Pennsylvania Republican, said out and out that if the Federalists denied Jefferson the presidency, that day would be, quote, the first day of revolution and civil war. Pretty blunt. Now, let's pause for a moment and turn to the other side. And let's look at what the Federalists were doing and what the Federalists were saying. And the person I want to highlight to do this is Mr. Bayard of Delaware. And he is the single delegate from Delaware at such a very small state. So he alone can sway the election depending on how he votes. So he ends up playing a really vital role. His letters in this period are really interesting. So he, and that's what I went and found them this morning. I probably read them however many 25 years ago when I began writing my first book, I don't know. But at this point in time, if I did read them, they had escaped my brain. So for me, some of this was new this morning. So he's writing to friends as this is happening, and then he writes a lot of letters after it happens, trying to explain what the heck happened. At first he says, some of our gentlemen, from an intemperate hatred to Jefferson, seem disposed to proceed to the most desperate extremities. And what are those desperate extremities? So this is what Bayard says, and in this case, he's looking after the election. He's thinking back. He says, well, the New England gentlemen came out and declared they meant to go without a constitution and take the risk of a civil war. They agreed that those who could not agree to incur such an extremity ought to secede without loss of time. Bayard is talking about New England members of Congress, Federalists, obviously behind the scenes, were scrummaging around, angry arguments, trying to figure out what to do. And Bayard says, well, New Englanders said they'd rather go without a constitution and take the risk of a civil war. And if you have a problem with that, maybe you should just secede. Okay, so they're talking about that to a degree that Bayard is writing this down to explain what happened to the ultimate settlement of the election. He then describes in his letters that these New Englanders were talked out of it, that somehow or other they were convinced, like, stay with the rest of us Federalists, like, don't go to that extreme a measure, stay with us, don't do that. So that extreme measure is talked out of, but who actually crossed the line then? Well, this is what Bayard says. Supporters of Mr. Jefferson had come to a determination which was known to have been solemnly made and was publicly avowed to risk the Constitution and the Union rather than give him up. Now, that actually is a way of saying what Jefferson said, right? We let it be known that we were prepared to resist Federalists crossing the line with armed resistance. Bayard is saying that the Republicans are prepared to cross a line with armed resistance. So everyone is pointing at someone else to say, like, well, no, you're crossing the line. How can that be? And that's where you are in the middle of the election of 1800. Ultimately, what happens is Bayard holds back his vote. No one ends up voting. No Federalist ends up voting for Thomas Jefferson. Bayard ends up abstaining, basically, and that allows Jefferson to win. He says the step was not taken till it was admitted on all hands that we must risk the Constitution and a civil war or take Mr. Jefferson. So that's how he explains to his friends why he did what he did. Federalists really didn't want Jefferson. They were going to go to really extreme measures. They were going to cross lines and say, to heck with the Constitution. We're going to do what it takes to keep Jefferson out. And Jefferson is saying, well, we're not maybe abandoning the Constitution. We're going to stretch it, and they need to be stopped with arms if necessary to protect the Constitution. That's what Bayard says to his friends. Here's what he says to John Adams, who's president at this point still, as to why he allowed Jefferson to win. He says, representing the smallest state in the Union, without resources which could furnish the means of self-protection, I was compelled by the obligation of a sacred duty so to act as not to hazard the Constitution upon which the political existence of the state depends. What he says, interestingly, to Adams is, Delaware, really small state. And if the Constitution goes down, we're powerless. We're going to be swallowed. We're going to be dissolved. I don't know what's going to happen to Delaware. And so he considered it his sacred duty as a means of self-protection to allow Jefferson to win rather than to endanger the Constitution. So he makes this a very savvy, above board political decision, which it is. Of course, what he doesn't say is behind the scenes, I was really scared that they were going to abandon the Constitution and start a civil war. That was part of this too. So clearly, there's a lot of line crossing in this election. This is why I've talked about it a number of times before, because I find it fascinating. And because I think, as with so many things in early American history, because they're distant in time, people either don't know about some of the extremity of that time or don't know the details of it. And particularly at this moment, some of those details are remarkably relevant, right? When I talk about moments in American history that feel very much like the present, I will often say one that everyone says, right? The 1850s. You could say the 1960s as well. Both of those are moments where people understand there's like potential tidal change in the nation in the winds. The other period I always mention is the late 1790s, because that's very much the same with extreme polarization, people going to desperate measures. People don't know that period. They certainly don't know the details of this election, but the degree to which here people were seriously considering and suggesting that they would cross lines, armed resistance, abandoning the Constitution, stretching the Constitution, ignoring what appeared to be the outcome of the election. In one way or another, people were threatening, at least, to really go to extreme measures and letting it be known. Like Jefferson knows what the Federalists are saying, the Federalists know what the Republicans are saying. But what's interesting to me about all of this is what they are holding out as the ultimate line. What they're all mentioning in one way or another, even as they're threatening it, is the Constitution, right? So Jefferson's worried that they're stretching the Constitution or they're going to abandon the Constitution. The Federalists as well are saying that, they're going to just attack us. They're going to take arms against us. They're not. How is that even constitutional? The Constitution, in a sense, even in the midst of this really fraught moment, is still an ultimate line. Now, in the end, it's actually not the threats that settle the election. Before Bayard does what he does, the Jefferson team lets it be known to Bayard's satisfaction that Jefferson won't do a handful of very extreme things that he might have done, but that he won't. He actually offers like footnotes, like tell Federalists they can go on this page and see what I said and notes on the state of Virginia about this issue. So he communicates with key Federalists, many of them not persuaded. Bayard happens to be one who is persuaded. But regardless, what's interesting is that there is an ultimate line that everyone agrees on, even as they're ready to risk civil war, the Constitution. And in a way, first of all, part of what that suggests is the vital importance of the American Constitution beyond the fact that it structures our government, beyond the fact that it's, essentially what structures our entire political process. The Constitution is the ultimate line, or it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be. One of the things that people worried about in the period of the creation of the Constitution, and Hamilton talks about this some, is that constitutions, and particularly this Constitution, can't be treated as, understood as, or accepted as just another piece of legislative paper. Constitutions need to stand alone. Constitutions need to have a kind of sacred power to them. People need to understand that, in a sense, constitutions are the ultimate line, and the American Constitution is the ultimate line. And so some of the extreme measures he either takes or suggests taking when he's Secretary of the Treasury have to do with this fact, which is if the people can violate the Constitution and get away with it, if there's no line crossed, if no one says you can't do that, the Constitution says you can't do that, then we're lost. Then the Constitution means nothing. So it is true, and even in this moment of crisis, people were still pointing to the Constitution and saying, well, that is the ultimate line. Now, there are other lines, right? There are lines of the law and the judicial process floating around out there. Apparently, and I have no idea how things stand this morning because everything right now changes on a 5-minute basis. But as of the last time I went online to check, Elon Musk had suspended the Twitter account of Kanye West, not for what he said on that podcast radio show, but because he tweeted a Jewish star with a swastika in the middle of it. I'm not going to comment on that, but even for Elon Musk, there was a line. It's a line probably based on corporate loss to some degree, or not wanting to be responsible for what comes of that. But still, even he, for some reason that he himself knows, drew a line. Sometimes that line is really thin as the present. And when I was taking my notes, I said, there's a line of law. There's a line perhaps of corporate loss. And then I said, there's a line of decency, a line of reason. And then I said, no, we're not really seeing a line of decency these days. And even a line of reason is not necessarily very much in play. But there still are some lines very thin and being crossed, gingerly often, but being crossed. So as ever, I talk about what I talk about, and then I bring it back to the present, and I discuss how what I'm talking about we can at least think about today. I think several things we can think about today. One is to call out the crossing of lines. And again, we can do what we can do. But generally speaking, whether it's us, whether it's the people who represent us, whether it's the press, whatever, when people cross these lines, they shouldn't be allowed to do it in secret. They shouldn't be allowed to do it without people pointing and saying a line has been crossed. If they're going to take that step, they need to own it. They need to be accountable for it. And that is a way to signal, to highlight, to advertise what's happening, rather than allowing things to kind of inch along, an inch here and an inch there. And by the time you notice that the line has been crossed, you're way past it. So the lines matter. I just saw on the bottom of the screen, are there any lines? It's a good question. But I do think even now, even as people seemingly are violating or doing something unconstitutional, they're still playing by those rules or claiming to, right? So no one yet has said, to hell with the Constitution. They may be acting that way. They haven't said that. They're still kind of clinging to that as some kind of standard. And in that sense, as sad as this is, the Constitution is a kind of line. It's a constitutional governance, and with it, the democracy that it creates is a very thin threatened line right now, but it still remains. And ultimately, people are still, regardless of the extreme actions that they're doing, are clinging to it and pointing to it as a way to get public approval, as a way to not be accountable for what they're doing, as a way to mask what they are doing. Define it as you like. But it's important to recognize, on the one hand, the importance of the Constitution in this, the fact that that line is there, and people shouldn't be allowed to violate it without people calling them out and explicitly saying, what you are doing is unconstitutional. Say it loudly. You know, back when the days of impeachment, I was called on to the 11th hour on MSNBC, and I was asked, tongue in cheek, Joanne, is impeachment unconstitutional? Because people were saying, you know, impeachment, it's a cross line, it's a cross line. And I had to say on national TV, on MSNBC, impeachment is in the Constitution. It is the line. But there were people playing with that idea about what's allowable, what's legal or constitutional. That really matters now. And we need to be alert to that. It needs to be public. Again, this is not, in a sense, not the most satisfying conclusion to my comments here to say, call it out, because I can't say, make it stop happening. That depends on people coming together to make that happen. That depends on a press that's willing to call it out and stand behind that. That depends on people being broadly aware when constitutional lines are being crossed. That depends on a populace that understands the urgency of those kinds of lines, particularly constitutional lines, being crossed, and the danger that that represents. That's why, you know, national public servants, members of Congress, the president, why they swear an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. That's not just rhetoric. That's the United States. That's who we are. And that's what should be happening. When people aren't doing that, we can't just shrug our shoulders, right? We have to be loud, we have to be public, and we have to encourage at least publicity and accountability. If you're going to behave in that way, if you're going to essentially abandon or violate the Constitution, then you're going to have to own that. Okay. And oh, there's the mug. I was so busy talking, I missed the mug. Okay. So I really struggled today. I took mugs out of my cabinet. I was pondering what to do. This is the one that I came up with, which somehow or other fits the mood of the moment. And it's the mug that says, funny, I don't recall asking for your opinion.
That's a great mug.
Which kind of just represents the current moment. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do whatever I want. So this was the closest I could come with, and not bad considering I do have a limited number of.
Oh, it's great.
And as I ever say, you know, this was not my mug before. Someone gave me this mug. I do not know who. I do not know if it's on the magical list. I apologize.
Spreadsheet for the mugs.
I was going to say, I did not check the spreadsheet. I do not. But at any rate, whoever gave this to me, thank you, because it's now been used multiple times because it is the mood of the moment. But okay, I will stop talking so that we can move on to questions.
Okay, we have lots of great questions, so we're going to jump right in. This one's from our friend Dave. He says, what sort of lines were crossed in Arizona with the county that refused to certify election results? Courts weighing in, possibility of not certifying, a Democrat would win the congressional seat instead of the Republican. Seems a couple of lines were crossed there. Is there any historical precedent for a line of not certifying election being crossed?
Oh, wow. Well, that I can't answer, only because the things that are happening now, on the one hand, in some ways, there isn't a precedent. In other ways, there are parts of it for which there might be, and I am not up on my 20th and 21st century political history. What's interesting, though, is that there was a suit, right? They were sued, as I believe it. I haven't been reading closely, but that the people who were decided not to certify the election, that there was talk of a suit. They were going to get sued for that. If that is correct, and some of you can be discussing this in chat, that represents people pointing to that line and saying, no, we don't know what to do to stop it, but let's turn to the law. What we're watching now, and again, this gets back to what I said, what we're seeing now is in a lot of states, Republicans trying to mess with the electoral process. They're doing it in a way that they can claim is constitutional, right? They're stretching the Constitution. They're doing it in a way that has very obvious outcome, which is not certainly democratic, but it shows you this sort of messy space. They're still clinging to the idea that somehow or other what they're doing isn't wrong. Oh no, because if they admit what they're doing is wrong, then they admit they don't deserve to be voted for. But even as they're doing that, they're masking, hiding the implications and impact of what they're doing. That's the messy moment that we're in. And it's complicated by the fact that I don't think enough people are actually very bluntly and explicitly explaining why certain things are unconstitutional or even just unacceptable. There's the state legislature, the Supreme Court's going to hear a case that has to do with the power that state legislatures have within elections. And part of the Republican case for saying that state legislatures have more power than one might think they have to determine elections is based on some documents that they're claiming exist that actually don't really exist. I signed on to, what do you call it when you write a brief that gets submitted to the Supreme Court?
Amicus?
Yes, thank you. An amicus brief. I signed on to that saying, and I'm not the one who knew this, I signed on to it, but Rosie Zagari and Jack Rakov and other historians had the data to say, yeah, this just doesn't exist. Like, nice claim, you can pretend like you've got written evidence from the Constitutional Convention, as a matter of fact, is what they claim, that they can do this, and it doesn't exist. That's important, Now what's interesting is we'll see what happens with the court. We have a court that isn't really plugged into history, shall we say. So, what I'm saying this morning, in a sense, is frustratingly not neat and tidy. I'm saying, let's call out all the line crossing, and then there's more line crossing than we can muster to talk about, right? There's just, it's in every way. But that's my phone. That's why I yell at my students.
Oh, I thought Newbie got loose or something.
No.
Newbie's like flying around the house.
Okay, I know. No, now I have turned off my phone like I would tell my students to do.
Right.
At any rate, there's a lot going on right now, and people need to be loud about stepping forward. I won't keep going because there's so many questions, but I hope that you get the larger point that I'm trying to make.
Okay, our really good friend Cece asks, if there were Federalists threatening violence, what about all their leadership? Did some of them, a few of them, condone that violence? And in our case, we know some party leaders encouraged it, but more of the base, hopefully not, So she's just wondering how that compares to the Federalists.
Oh, interesting. Well, what's interesting, that's a really good question. What you had was New England congressmen saying, we are willing to take desperate measures. We are willing to just not allow Jefferson to become president. And perhaps that will result in violence. We are willing to risk violence. Now, I wrote a book about how people can use threats and intimidation to get what they want, even if they don't ever necessarily do anything violent. As long as people believe that they can do the violent act, it gives you a certain degree of power. So in the case of the Federalists, I don't know what would have happened if things had proceeded further, but on both sides, it's important to note that there was talk of being willing to go to violent measures. Each side knew that the other side was talking about that, but there wasn't action. And as far as I know, and it would be interesting to research it, this was talk from the top and not from the base. Right? This was people on the top saying, what can we do to rig the system, right? To do something to stop the other team, the elite team, from taking this election. So in that sense, it's different. And in that sense, that's part of what the election of 1800 was about, right? the Republicans, the Democratic Republicans, were more comfortable with democracy, with protest. Part of what was being argued about in the late 1790s was how democratic this nation would be. And so that's, the question of who is the base and how do you appeal to the base and what role does the base play? I've talked before about how one of the things that the founders believed set the United States apart from all of these monarchies around the world was that in a democratic republic, public opinion matters more. It's grounded on public opinion. What the government does is grounded on public opinion to an extreme degree. Now, they didn't agree on who the public was. How do you find the public? What the public thinks? That's reality sort of leaking in. But they're very focused in the 1790s on what I suppose we now call in one way or another the base, although now it's a party base. They were figuring out in this period who the public was and how do you appeal to the public and what does the public think and how much should we be appealing to the public, with the Federalists saying, I don't think we should involve them very much at all. And the Republicans saying, yeah, I think we really should. So that's something in that period. We're in a totally different environment now, because some of what the people on the top are doing is actually not intended for each other, but intended for other people on another level that explicitly are beyond their power, right? They, I think, would assume they win if they can say lots of things to get other people to break laws and cross lines. And then the people who break laws and cross lines, they might end up getting arrested. They might end up getting punished. But the people who encouraged it, well, they didn't cross the line, did they? That's part of the moment that we're in right now. And we're watching that play out. And it's another moment when are the people who encouraged that kind of violence, are they going to be held accountable for that? And we don't know the answer yet.
Gosh, you kind of just gave me chills, Joanne, because it makes me think of that backstory episode y'all did right after Charlottesville. And it was the same thing. The people that organized that Unite the Right rally,
right.
One of them did eventually face some consequences, but it went through like years of appeals. It was like just this past summer that person only had some financial penalties, but I don't even think he's serving jail time now.
Right.
But it's just kind of the same thing. And I didn't really think of that until what you just said.
Well, and we're watching, the oath keeper whose name slips my mind, right? We're watching people lower down get held accountable. But the question of holding anyone accountable who was on the top and had a broad audience and either assisted things or stoked, sort of fueled feelings or said things. That's a pretty important line. That's part of why I said you have to have a hearing to at least say lines have been crossed, but you can't only say in a general way lines have been crossed. Now we need to talk about who crossed the lines and how they crossed the lines. And there was some talk of that, and there are people in a total state of denial, and here we are. So I wish I could be here and say, here's what has to happen. I can't, but that's where we are, is that there are people on the ground level who were pushed, who were encouraged, let's say not pushed, encouraged, appealed to, their basest instincts played up, and they did what they were, sort of fueled up to do. And the people on the top helping pour the fuel are just standing by and continuing to pour in some ways. And I have no ready solution to what we do. It's just important to point that out.
Yeah.
Oh, there, Rhodes was the name of it. I just saw that.
Sort of a follow-up to this last one that I think you could kind of knock out pretty quickly is from Dale, our good buddy Dale. So he is asking, where was Hamilton both politically and emotionally during that election of 1800? Like, what was his line?
Yeah. Well, his last years and his last letter were all devoted to holding the Union together. His last letter talks about the threat of democracy, that the democracy might be what destroys the country. But more than anything else, what he's worried about is holding the Union together. And before the duel, I think it's Rufus King knew about the duel in advance and leaves town, I think to go to New England. And supposedly Hamilton told him to, whatever you do, talk to them about holding the Union together. So in 1800, he certainly wouldn't have been on the side that was like, yeah, let's like risk the Constitution, risk the Union. What he was mostly focused on in 1800 was Jefferson or Burr. In his mind, he was acting to save the Union and not doing what the Federalists were doing. He was actively promoting Jefferson. Now, he was actively promoting Jefferson in a really Hamiltonian way. So, I might have read this letter before. It's a hilarious, not to him, but to us, letter in which he is explaining why Jefferson is better than Burr. And he's also been attacking Jefferson for 15 years, saying everything about him. So how do you then step forward and say, vote for Jefferson? So he has the longest run-on sentence in which he's like, I admit Jefferson is this, and a contemptible hypocrite. Like, all of that's true. And the but is, he cares so much about what the public thinks about him that he won't try to do anything really risky or dangerous because it might make people not like him. So he's a safer bet than Burr, who will do anything and everything to get what he wants. That's basically where Hamilton comes down, not on the side of where most of the Federalists are, which is anything but Jefferson. He's writing to them all and saying, Jefferson, it can't be Burr, which is why those of you out there who are Hamilton musical fans, when the musical suggests that somehow or other Hamilton helped decide the election of 1800, there really isn't evidence for that. What we have evidence of is Hamilton writing a lot of letters, including to Bayard, as a matter of fact, knowing his key importance in this election, explaining over and over and over and over again why Burr is unacceptable. Not necessarily why Jefferson is acceptable, but why Burr is unacceptable. And the Federalists largely don't listen. They're in their own little mix, their own little scrum, arguing with each other about seceding from the Union or whatever they're talking about. So he didn't decide that election, and he wasn't necessarily in line with not all, but at least a lot of the Federalists. The Federalists obviously were divided, and you can see that in the way they're grappling with the election. But so he was kind of on his own weird little island that was more focused on protecting the nation by getting Jefferson elected president. And that's clearly, until the very end, not what the Federalists saw. It's at the very end that, Bayard is like, well, if we don't allow him to be president, then the Constitution is going to be threatened, and then maybe Delaware is going to sink or get eaten. So I guess we'd better do this.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question from Dave. He's asking, did Jefferson have more popular votes? It didn't occur to those at the time that the Electoral College was problematic, and were they okay with keeping democracy a couple of steps removed from electing a president at that time with senators?
Well, and the question of the popular vote is really complicated in this period because sometimes to an extreme degree, every state, and there's still variations today, we're watching it all the time. But at the time, some states had their state legislature pick electors. And so actually New York. So people voted for legislators, state legislators, and the legislatures voted for electors, and the electors picked a president. So in that case, I suppose you could finagle what the popular vote was, but it's not as easy as saying they voted for this elector. It's like they voted for someone who is likely to choose this kind of elector, so I think the popular vote was tricky to figure out, number one, and number two, in this early period, I don't think anyone, even the Republicans, would be ready to say, what matters more than everything else? What the public wants. We're talking about kind of fundamental degrees of democratic governance in this period. And no one is open to the degree of democracy that we assume, or at least want, to have today.
Yeah. Okay, this one comes from Sandra. Our buddy Sandra asks, do you think Kanye is just performing for the Republicans, on top of being anti-Semitic, to depress the votes in Georgia, where there are two Black candidates in the runoff election. She says, I've noted McCarthy and McConnell have not called out Trump for hosting Kanye.
Right.
And that seems strange to her. And also that the focus is more on not being able to remember the name of the white nationalist that Kanye brought to dinner with him.
Right. Do I think he's performing? Yes, for sure. For any number of reasons, for ego, for self-promotion, because he's being urged on by people who are taking advantage of him, whatever, people are saying, well, he's mentally ill, whatever the reasons. Yeah, he's performing. That said, I'm never a fan of saying just performing, because rhetoric has consequences, right? So whether he's just performing or not, what he is doing is spreading a sentiment and a feeling and a logic out into the world and encouraging people who have that sentiment, feeling, and logic. So whether he's just performing or not, in a way, that's almost irrelevant. What he's doing is explicitly encouraging anti-Semitism, and at a moment when the nation, in its own way, some in the nation are very open to that. And I was thinking about this yesterday. So in the minds of like major anti-Semites, what they're attacking when they attack Jews is power, right? They have this idea that like Jews have all this power, Jews control the media, Jews, I don't know, like the secret cabal of Jews. I always joke that somehow there's this image out there that there's like this underground cabal of like Jewish people with headphones on, like do 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 with the telegraph, like sending out their universal message to the world, whatever. I think some of these anti-Semites think that they're attacking power so that they can get power. So some of the anti-Semitism is on the part of people who are just in their mind attacking people who hold power so they can have more. I don't know. So in the end, why Kanye is doing what he's doing is less important than the fact that he's doing it, and that he's doing it now, and that he has a big platform to do it from, and that he's encouraging some of the not the ugliest or the only ugly, but among the ugliest instincts of some people. And how do you argue with gut feeling? How do you argue with sentiment? How do you argue with hate? That's an idea I've been playing with in a piece I've been writing, which is very hard to write. But that's what this does, right? This kind of rhetoric, this kind of behavior encourages sort of a gut feeling, like claiming to be a victim, right? If you feel like you're a victim, that's powerful. It's like, wait, I feel outraged. I'm a victim. And I hate the people who are making me a victim. It's very hard to reason with that. Like, that's a feeling. That's not necessarily a logic. How do you reason with hate? How do you give evidence that will contradict hate? It's a big question. I'm sure there are many people who have thought about it, but that's a good question to ask for the present too. We have people who are encouraging hate, running on hate, fostering hate, and they're doing it explicitly because it's hard to argue with. It's a gut feeling. It can unite people, right? We all feel the victim, and we're all hating together. It's a powerful thing, hate, and we're confronting it not for the first time in American history by far, but that's at the core of our current moment.
Yeah. Well, speaking of hate, that's a horrible transition. Bailey asked an interesting question, and they state might be too heavy. Maybe you don't want to answer it, but Bailey's asking, before the Civil War, was the blood libel or other anti-Semitic slander issues present to the significant degree in the United States as we're seeing like in more recent years or other periods in history? And if so, what were some of the ways that people either collectively or individually push back? Like, were there certain politicians specifically addressing that? Or were they more generic, like freedom of religion statements?
Well, so I'll have a two-part answer, and one is based on a hunch. I think the blood libel is always there. I just think it's always there. The question is how loud people are when they talk about it. So, was that there? For sure. How the degree to which people were talking about it and how it was infiltrating its way into politics, that I don't know. So I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I don't know to what degree anti-Semitism was used or not used. I mean, perhaps my not knowing suggests it wasn't a major thread, but I honestly just don't know. And it's a really good question, particularly given what I talked about today.
Yeah.
I don't know.
As someone just said, we're having like really great, both in the chat and really great questions today. I'm almost like distracted between the two. It's both so fascinating. Okay, we only have one more and it's 2 minutes to go. We can do this, Joanne. Dave was going to wrap it up for us. He's asking how, when, or by whom is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment enforced? Is it just a word on paper about when lines are crossed and there are no consequences?
That's a big question. And in a sense, that's the ultimate question, right? Not just that particular amendment, but generally speaking, we have the lines. What do we do when they're clearly crossed?
Yeah.
And the document says you've crossed them. Are they just lines? Are they just rhetorical? Are they going to be enforced? We are in a moment when that is being tested.
Yeah.
In a major way. And I'm going to quote, I think I'm going to quote the end of the first paragraph of the first Federalist essay. The choice we will make may deserve to be considered as the general, if we make the wrong choice, it may deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind.
That's a mug.
That's
a t-shirt, that's a mug, that's a tattoo on my arm.
He says that, he's saying that about the Constitution. He says basically, we're determining for all time whether you can put a bunch of people in a room and have them reason their way into creating a constitution and a nation, or if nations are going to forever be based on force and coincidence in one way or another. Can you do this in a reasonable way? And I guess he's talking about what he's saying in that first paragraph, and I read it a lot in my classes. We can help decide that. As a matter of fact, what we are doing now may decide that. We are helping to decide for all time if you can do this. Can you do this? Not accident and force, but actually reason your way into having a country. If we do this wrong, this may result in the general misfortune of mankind. Huge sentiment. He's trying to get people who are reading these Federalist essays to understand what he believes to be the gravity of the moment and the bigger implications of the moment. But if you have it for a while, go read that first paragraph. The last half of that first paragraph of the first Federalist essay is pretty amazing prose on the part of Hamilton.
Well, we did it. We cleared all the questions.
Look at that, with like 1 minute.
I know. We're good this week.
Yeah, I'm gonna save the chat, even though we'll keep going. Okay.
Well, since I had to switch devices, John, make sure you send me the chat link for the whole chat because I only have part of it. Okay.
Now, as we are on the moment of change here, for those of you who may be new, we are now going to move into the after party. Yeah, now comes the poof. Poof. So basically, we're going to stop recording what we're doing. And we are going to keep talking about whatever we want to talk about, but because we won't be recording it, we can be a lot freer with what we say. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are, and indeed, poof, you will be in the after party. If you are on Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you will also, poof, be in the after party. I'm glad we're all back together. It's a fine thing. I will see you all next week. I hope everyone has a good week. And given the way that our news cycle works, it'll probably be Thursday night. But I'm like, yes, I know. You guys, Thursday nights are anxious times for me. At any rate, we are going to head off into the after party. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for engaging in the process of democracy, particularly given today's conversation. We can have these kinds of conversations. We can ask big questions. We can foster the kind of awareness that we need to have and that others need to have to keep democracy going. So thank you as ever for being here for that. And thank you, Annie, on the road beaming in. Thank you, John, for making the entire thing possible. And we will see you all next week.